Hello everyone. Today's rain, I think, was a great primer for Peter's session. And when I studied history, if I had this book, I would have loved history, and I envy his students for two main reasons. One is that the earth transformed decenters to a good extent human agency.
I'm going to show it at the back so you can see it. There we go. There we are.
Yeah. And looks at an agent who's much vaster, which is climate and nature itself. And secondly, he asks a totally different set of questions to the past, which then brings up a completely different set of revelations, where most of the search party is not. And I was reading through this, I was reminded of Werner Heisenberg, who said, "We don't see reality as it is, but its aspect exposed to our questioning." And Peter, somewhere there is my first question. What was your process of inquiry and questioning and research for this? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Yuvan. Thank you, JLF, for inviting me to come to this fantastic festival. And thank you all for being here. I'm glad you're not just here because it's raining, because the rain has stopped. It's a very good question. I mean, this amazing festival, there's been two parallel themes, I think. One has been, there's been a lot of discussion about climate and climate change, the crisis, renewable energy. And then there's been lots on literature, history, and so on. And there's been not much relationship between these two, right? So we hear the history that I learned at school was about almost all of them great men, a few great women, Queen Elizabeth I flying the flag for women, but that was about it. And that kind of Netflixization of history where we're only looking at individuals. There was a panel this morning about biographies and how to write biographies, means that we will go through thinking about the past without ever considering weather conditions, use of natural resources, whether they're exploited or underexploited, overexploited. And these big themes that are very boring for most people, but for historians it's our bread and butter, of things like logistics, soil sedimentation in rivers and ports, how people are thinking about the natural world. It's very easy to forget because we tend to prioritize history as human agency. But despite what we think, we're not the only species on this planet. And despite what we might think, if we destroy our own environment quickly enough, there's going to be a lot fewer of us in the future. So I think my job as a historian is to explain how it is that we've come to that bit in the beginning of a Bollywood film where Shah Rukh Khan is hanging onto the skyscraper with one hand, about to fall. And the good news is Shah Rukh Khan normally never falls, right? That's what happens. He saves the day. But how is it that we've come to a point where we're talking about biodiversity loss, a sixth mass extinction? And then how have people in the past thought about periods of change, which is what we're living through, both of technology, the natural world, new hierarchies, inequalities, and so on. And so the process was, how do I start at the beginning? And as a historian, I'm embarrassed that I never really thought about geological formations, the roles of ecosystems before humans. History for me started with Mesopotamian civilizations, Indus Valley, and that's such a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the world's history, and it over-prioritizes human agency. So those interactions of weather systems, the natural world, how our world exists even today. I'm a football fan, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, my team is Chelsea. The current champion, the best team in the world today, is Manchester City. And if I were to ask most people why, they'd say they've got the best players. They've got the best manager. If you're really enlightened, you say they've got the best training staff, the best nutritionists. But the reason why Manchester City are the best team in the world is because they're owned by a sovereign wealth fund that sits on top of one of the world's greatest hydrocarbon basins that was formed hundreds of millions of years ago. And the gas that sits under that provides almost unlimited wealth for Abu Dhabi, who owns Manchester City, or part of Abu Dhabi, to buy the best place, have the best facilities. And those roles in which the natural world is always constant around us, but we don't think about it, goes through to everything. The British Empire. The great challenge of the British Empire in the 20th century was that although a quarter of the world was coloured pink, there was almost no oil. And before 1900, oil wasn't really exploited in big commercial quantities, but from 1900 onwards, it started to be. And that helped explain the maps that were drawn in the Middle East that, they're here today to remind us of what happens of the search for commodities and resources. So to think about the natural world, to think about how it's exploited, and also how the natural world shapes and dictates where we are, is hugely important. In a city like Jaipur, where you use 1.4 million litres of water every day in the city, and you have one water source, apart from the rains that came today. You have the dam, that's it. So thinking about environmental envelopes, thinking about the challenges and the opportunities that provides, I think it's a good starting point to think about history as a whole.
Jumping on to that, there are certain central players in the book. They include, and one might never come across them in other history textbooks, and that makes it unique, solar flares and minima, microbial activity, ocean currents, and volcanic eruptions, and how they shaped human history, where there's some sense of, oh, we did this, but no, we were being puppeted. That's the background which comes at me. Would you reflect on that?
Well, so our planet has lots of very complex interconnected weather systems that they don't always behave in the way that we imagine and expect, and they're highly complex. But there are some certain rhythms that the Earth has in terms of the eccentricity of its orbit, how the sun behaves, and so on, that shape the world that we live in. Now, as far as humans exist and are concerned, the single biggest challenge to organized states are shocks. If you are caught unprepared for something, then those shocks typically will tend to increase inequalities. They will tend to lead to state disruption. And one question I ask in my book a lot is, when societies collapse, that's bad for archaeologists, right? When people stop building big temples in Tikal in Guatemala that I write about, the great Mayan world, around about the year 800 or 900, there's a whole system of network collapses, not just to do with climate change. There was a 70-year unusually long drought period, but all the overlapping ways in which the lime plaster would come off when it did rain into water tanks that then poisoned populations with mercury, and mercury we know is linked to violence, it's linked to cognitive issues and so on. When those Mayan temples stopped being built, that's a disaster if you're a historian of the Maya people. It's really bad if you're a member of the Mayan elite. Same with the temples in Gangai Konda Cholapuram. This massive new temple, we heard about the Cholas yesterday. That's really bad. But if you are a peasant working in the fields, the collapse of your priesthood and of your secular rulers may not necessarily be a bad thing. In fact, it might be quite a good thing, because the results of your labor don't flow to someone else. So the challenge, I think, is how to think about where states rise and fall, who do they benefit, how do networks that look robust, how can they suddenly collapse? And the good or bad news is, last time I was here in Jaipur 4 years ago was just as the pandemic was starting to shut us all down in 2020, and it turns out that a single event in a single city in a single country locked us all up for best part of 2 years and did all those things: inequality, government debts, huge shock, incompetence, wastage, and has fed into this kind of brittle world that we see around us. And so how you factor in climate and the natural world into much bigger things, it's really important to have nuance. This is where my book is quite long. But it's important, I think, to be recentering away from, it's not just decisions made in Delhi, in London, or by Donald Trump, or whoever it might be, but these highly complex, interconnected networks across natural worlds and everything else too.
I think the shock theory explains, it's just coming as a revelation, where if you look at Indian lawmaking, you look at the Environment Protection Act, it came after the Bhopal gas tragedy. You look at a bunch of other things, something has to, people don't seem to, act preemptively, but something shocks and then it comes.
Well, I'll give an example. So the awful earthquake off the coast of Japan that impacted the terrible tsunami that then led to the destabilization of the Fukushima nuclear facility. As a direct result of that, the anti-nuclear lobby in Germany, which has always been very powerful, the Green lobby in Germany is very powerful and very successful in translating election results into seats in parliament and to being part of the government, decided that this showed that nuclear power, the dangers of nuclear power. And Angela Merkel, who was the beleaguered chancellor at the time, did what lots of politicians do. You move and you take the best ideas of your rivals, right? And maybe that's a good thing in democracies. But she announced 2 weeks afterwards that the German nuclear industry would be shut down. And as a result, Germany has still a very high manufacturing base. very energy intensive. The most logical place to replace that energy shortage was by building new pipelines from Russia. And that dependency on Russian energy was about 55% before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so the process that Putin had to think about what would be the implications of a Russian invasion, military operation as he called it, special military operation, was that Europe would starve and Europe would freeze. And that was to do with thinking about geology, of course, but also about these shock events that are deeply, deeply connected. So you're exactly right, Yuvan. When you are not prepared for things, and then you're caught by surprise, you tend to react badly and sometimes dangerously. I suppose it's like driving a car. You don't get to do this in Jaipur except for late at night or early in the morning. You tend not to be able to drive at 70 or 80 miles an hour. But if you are driving fast and something bad happens, your opportunity to correct it are limited. If you're driving at 10 miles an hour, then you're fine. So preparing for those impacts are important. And again, you mentioned volcanoes. That the main US volcano observatory in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, one of the world's massive supervolcanoes, put out a press statement in December 2022 which said Mauna Loa is waking up. And it quoted Benjamin Franklin rather ominously saying, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. So all of these things around us, pathogenic diseases, pandemics, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, the ways in which we're highly connected to each other, makes us all hyper-fragile. And when you start to look at connections like the Silk Roads, when you think about networks in pre-Columbian Americas, if you look at the ways in which trans-Saharan traffic has been arranged over millennia, then things can fall and fold very, very quickly. And that comes as a surprise, because most people think that empires are robust and they're large and they're stable, but it doesn't work that way.
If I might take a specific period which I found very deeply interesting and uncovering of many things, that period between 15th century and 18th century, where it's called the Little Ice Age, and you specifically talk about the Atlantic Meridian Oscillation. There's an ocean current which reverses itself and completely changes whatever's happening in Europe, including movement from there and deaths. And would that be a nice thing to talk about?
Great. Yeah, I mean, so we historians, we argue a lot about names and labels. And if you were to ask my colleagues who work on this all the time what the Little Ice Age is and when does it start and finish, there'd be as many answers as there are people on the stage. But broadly speaking, there's a period between around about 1550 and 1800, give or take, where we see, in many parts of the world, not all parts of the world, but we see much cooler conditions for all sorts of different reasons, partly to do with, in the 1590s, a set of volcanic eruptions, about 5 big ones, that creates in the Northern Hemisphere the coldest decade for the last 2,000 years. And that has lots of implications and impacts. One is that it's much harder to heat buildings, so you have rooms seem to become smaller, or they become smaller, over the course of the 1600s, partly to do with the fact that that you need less energy to heat them. A bunch of clever scholars suggest that with smaller rooms, the capacity for gossip goes up because you can talk unobserved. And that leads into the ways in which narrative histories, in which poetry, in which the literary traditions start to change. Smaller rooms require different kind of art to be hung on the wall. So there are lots of things that might flow from the fact that it's cold, or it might be that those were flowing anyway, and the fact that it's cold is completely irrelevant. But the key, I think, in this as a period is it's a 300-year period where European footprints expand globally. So it's a period of intense competition in our small continent of Europe, highly unstable for many, many reasons. From 1350 until more or less the start of the 20th century, there wasn't a single decade that didn't involve major confrontation between European powers, sometimes in Pondicherry, sometimes in other parts of the world, sometimes in the Caribbean, but often in Europe itself. So one of the other themes you see alongside cooler conditions, anxieties about migration. We find graffiti in Elizabethan graveyards in the 1590s saying, we're going to come for anybody who's Jewish or foreign because you are like the Dutch, you steal our women, you take away our food and you feed yourselves. The ideas of xenophobia and the poisonous things that come with anxieties and shortages, the interesting ways in which the later Shakespeare plays involve winter and coldness and so on. Winter's Tale, of course, being one of those. But I think that what happens alongside this is you find new technologies that come alongside change, and a lot of those are to do with militarization. Some are to do with gunpowder, some are to do with improvements in metalwork, some are to do with in terms of better training. So typically battles between European armies in the 1600s will have a few thousand casualties, and they'll be over quite quickly because you can't load your gun fast enough. By 1700, they involve tens of thousands of casualties, and they allow for mass use of force. So in this period of climatic change, when transatlantic trade is booming, if you're European, shipping of enslaved peoples from Africa in particular to North America, South America, and the Caribbean, and then the expansions into Europe, then calculations about wind speed and how well you can sail in westerly or easterly winds makes a big difference. And there's a differential of about 80 kilometers per day if you're sailing into a westerly wind or into an easterly wind. These shift roughly every 15 years. So some of these things I think are setting a scene for, well, it's not just a little ice age, it's an age of colonizations by the northern hemisphere. Lots of interest about saying the reason why Europeans are able to dominate the world is because people in cold climates thrive and people in tropical climates don't. And you've heard Mary Bid talk about the Roman Empire. It doesn't take you much to know the Roman Empire was a nice warm place. Typically you wore a nice leather dress. You sit in the hills of Tuscany today drinking rosé. But those sort of ways in which the world interconnected in a period of globalization, where the intense anxieties around calorie provision, the redistribution of global crops, were all part of a discrete period where, for lots of reasons, for lots of periods, in the northern hemisphere there were cooler conditions. But from the Little Ice Age point of view, from the perspective of India, what mattered much more were the failure of monsoon rains in the 1760s that lays the conditions for what's known as the Bengal famine, the deaths of millions, and maybe many, many millions, and then leads to the rupture, the collapse, if Willie Dalrymple's here, about the East India Company, which is directly connected to the Declaration of Independence in Northern American colonies. So none of it is driven by the fact that it's a bit cold or there's lots of volcanic eruptions, but factoring in wind speeds, factoring in ocean temperatures, factoring in improvements in technologies, lots of interest in European slavers to work out how do they drive up their profits by improving sanitation so that even more people can be enslaved and shipped across, to work on lands that are more fertile in the 1700s onwards than they were in the 1500s. For example, the Spanish in Florida kept writing home for the first 100 years saying, Florida is absolutely bloody freezing. There's nothing we can grow here. It's a useless piece of land. And when I look at Florida or hear about Florida, that's where old people go to retire in the sunshine, and you grow oranges and you play golf. And the idea that this was a freezing cold place didn't make any sense until you start to think, well, what were the conditions at that time? So the Little Ice Age can be a capture for lots of different ideas and themes, but layering in the transformations and the changes into whatever aspect of the histories you're looking at, I just think it's a factor that's very, very easy to overlook.
Okay. I think one of the beautiful things about the book is that you show interconnectedness as the earth and all the various politics and climatic changes as a whole. And I wonder if we can speak a little bit more about India, which is a common thread, and you speak quite a bit about it. Yeah.
That's a small question. I've already given quite long answers, so we could be here for a while. Well, I think you start at the beginning, I suppose, with the written text, the sacred Vedas onwards, and then the Upanishads, and the ways in which writers in the past are thinking deeply about the natural world, and often in ideas about harmony and of interactions with the divine. And in the Hindu traditions, in the Indic traditions, a bit like in most other faith systems, the appearance of rain from the skies when it's been too hot is a sign of divine benevolence. It's a sign of the right prayers being said by the right people in the right way, the right form of living, morality. In China, for example, the famous mandate of heaven that the emperor carries is very closely connected to predictable climatic sequences, partly because agrarian economies rely on food being grown. And if you have drought, you find it hard to grow food. And if you have floods, you have crops that are washed away. So lots of states, lots of belief systems are very interested in those interactions between the divine, trying to work out why is there sometimes suffering, what have we done wrong, why are we being rewarded, and connections to moralities. So those kinds of ideas, I think when you then start to move forward in time and you see edicts like the great Ashoka saying we need to have interdictions on cutting down the forests, we need to marshal our resources carefully, we shouldn't have the slaughter of innocent animals, we need to protect resources. Some of that is about imperial or royal control over money and ritual and of power, but some of it is also about a much more thoughtful engagement about making sure there's enough for everybody to go round. And then when you move onwards, I read things like Vajramira Mira writing about, in the Gupta dynasties, writing about what happens when the sun's rays are unusually weak and the crops can't grow and it feels like you're living in a ghost world. And he's writing this at a time when, again, there is a sequence of eruptions in the 530s, 540s of our era that are directly connected to the really big pandemic of the period that has an impact here in northern India too, which we can measure, where you see the collapse of trading networks of what's known as the Justinianic plague, a plague that spreads out probably from foci in Central Asia, is carried because probably those cold climates drive the animals that can help transmit the pathogen into contexts that they need to find more food, and typically they'll come closer to human settlements, and when that happens, the ignition, like with the bat in Wuhan, takes everything in front of it, and the Y. pestis, the Yersinia pestis pathogen, can establish itself in a rat colony for 150 years, if it's established, and it's spread not just by rats who take all the blame in histories. Here in India, the rat has a very different role to how it has in Western histories, but all sorts of different animals can spread these pandemics, and so the questions about why diseases come from, who is being punished and why, all very closely, I think, connected into climate instabilities and shocks. And then, again, like I said, with the Cholas, one of the things that's most interesting about the great Chola Empire of southern India and its expansions and pushes eastwards is that it doesn't do so on its own. This is in a period, it's called the medieval warm period, that has the same problems that the Little Ice Age has too in having the evidence to support where there's stability. But the Chola world you can't understand without seeing it in connection with the Khmer world, the world of Pagan, the great Abbasid Empire, the Sung in China, the late antique, the revival of the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. And these worlds all mushroom together in an age of globalization. And the Indian subcontinent is a pivot that connects the north and the south and the east and the west, the maritime connections, and of course, more important, the overland ones, because the demographies of Asia are inland, particularly into the Persian world, into China, and into Central Asia, these great metropolis cities, the centers of learning. So India fits, the Indian subcontinent, the different dynasties fit into thinking globally, and of course thinking regionally, but it's a sort of fundamental part of how we think about history. In my profession as historians, we've not been good enough about connecting Indian histories into these great global narratives, because it's quite hard to do. And it's quite hard to not just be regional, but to think over long periods of time. But the Indian experiences in terms of consumption, in terms of expenditure, in terms of the ways in which the natural world are one of the great stories of our common world histories. And it's great to see how many young historians here in Indian universities are working on these topics, because and in fact was almost led from scholars here thinking about how to engage better with the natural world and its teachings. Okay.
One chapter which was specifically interesting, and I went through it multiple times, was that on nature and sacrality. And a common sort of occurrence seemed to be that the genesis of any sacrality religion drew from nature in some sense, and then forgot about it. Drew from it, forgot about it, and at every age there seemed to be, who we now see as the Fridays for Future movement or the extinction. I mean, there was somebody or some text or some poet saying, we are screwing up, we got to stop, or that could have even been an emperor. And you speak about everything from Gilgamesh to China to, and that repeating sense of things have vanished, and as such, things weren't put to a stop, and that cycle seems to have continued.
Well, it continues now. I mean, you could think of some of the climate activists who I have a huge amount of respect for as a form of new organized religion. We have priests and priestesses of this movement, a lot of them very young, but the message of apocalyptic consequences of thoughtlessness is one that has lots of echoes from different belief systems way back into the past. I suppose that, as someone who's also an economic historian, I suppose the kind of starting point for me is looking at how priests had established control of the sacral message. Well, that's what I suppose you're also asking about. And some of that is to do with the establishment of writing systems, the codification of knowledge, the protection of knowledge. Universities, they are specifically exclusive. They don't let people in. That's like my university. You have to apply, but most people don't get in. We could be teaching everybody for free, but we can't. We don't. We don't do our courses online. We charge people. We control the message. Please, I hope my Vice-Chancellor isn't watching, because I could be in trouble for saying that. But, I think that the story of religions is also about the establishment of a priestly class, often with a dual balance with kingly power, that controls messages and enforces them and establishes sacred texts that are in harmony. The Tripitaka tradition of Buddhism is about saying there's one set of texts. You can't have divergences. My Christian faith, where I come from, again, the church councils that insist that what the profession of faith looks like, insist on what the messages are, what counts as heresy, tears the church apart repeatedly many, many, many times. It's the same thing with the Judaic tradition, same thing with the Holy Quran. So we see this in many, many different ways about who carries the message and who has the right to protect knowledge. And, for example, in the Indic traditions, not just in Hinduism, the complexity of those stories is a barrier, right? It's designed so that only people who have spent a long time studying the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Vedas, etc., can really truly understand these works. And that's a way of saying that you need to study and that their power should go to the people who control those. And often those fit into building of structures, of temples, agricultural control, and often it becomes a power rival to the church, or to the state. So we find, for example, in Pagan, in the Khmer world, we were just now in Nilkanth, not too far away from about an hour's drive from here, where so many temples get built that there's a suffocation process that kills economic production, because these temples control so much land, they have so many tax concessions, they're supporting so many priests who are unproductive economic units, because people like us who have to study, we write books, but we don't build roads, we don't dig sewage, we don't recycle other people's waste. That means that the existence of a priesthood is very important in that context of sacral messages, and how the emergence of an intellectual class sits alongside economic power is kind of one of the stories, I think, that is unique to civilized urban societies. It doesn't look the same in many nomadic or oral traditions where you have shamans who play a role, but the shaman is usually a very small part demographically of a wider tribal unit. There's normally one or a series of whereas priesthoods, there are often thousands, thousands and thousands of priests, of rabbis, of imams, of holy men. And the more you have of those, the harder those balances of intellectual inequality as well as economic and social.
If we can look at that a bit more deeply, the sort of interplay between climate and inequality, and what that sort of a relationship is. And perhaps a related question would be, if we could speak about the latter part of the book, the modern period. And you speak about a range of conferences and treaties which make these big decisions, and do they trickle down to the ground?
Well, you've written about this. What do you think?
I'd give a short answer to that, but if you
please,
yeah.
I'd like to hear what you think.
Yeah, in some sense, I've felt, and I'm definitely not a historian, so I think good solutions or good practices, relationalities are unique, so they sort of emerge locally, but at the same time, they seem to be vulnerable to big forces. So I'm at a tussle, So what's the middle path? Would be the question I'd ask myself. Yeah.
I think local communities, wherever they are, normally are quite good at trying to find solutions. That you find that with indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, forest peoples, small villages tend to be quite good, because the interconnections of kinship, the interconnections of ritual, and the fact that everybody is linked in together, that obviously can help. my view is I'm highly critical in my book about the problems that cities give us. Cities give us lots of wonderful things. They give us literature festivals, for one thing. They give us the opportunity to meet each other, to buy and sell things, to listen to new ideas, to exchange genetics, which I'm not going to talk about again today. But the way in which we can meet each other and have different relationships. Hugely wealthy, but cities are also parasites because they are not producers. They're consumers. They drag in. They have energy needs. They have water needs. They create problems. Here in Jaipur this morning, the particulate matter is 4 times WHO deemed safe levels, right? So everybody here breathing this air, we are experiencing shorter, like in India in 2018, 1.6 million people died from fossil fuel complications to do with air pollution, right? That's a lot. 18% of all deaths in 2018 globally have been attributed to air quality pollutions. And so when you live intensively, you tend to bet on a short-term answer rather than the long-term one. But most of the societies that I've spent my career being interested in, pre-Mongol, steppe nomadic peoples, oral traditions, are very, very good at balancing environmental challenges because they have some resilience built in them and cities tend not to. And perhaps I think it's no coincidence that those histories of nomadic peoples from the Mongols through to the Mughals here now, the narrative changing in India, has always been highly pejorative, very negative. That these people are considered barbaric, people who don't live in cities, who don't want to have priests, don't want to have libraries, don't want to have universities. But actually the sophistication of governance, the sophistication of stability are in some way, and the complexity are often hugely impressive to look at. So I think that trying to think through what are the costs of how we live, it's really important. But here, no one in Jaipur wants the air quality to be worse. No one will leave here and go, I'm really pleased it's only 4 times, not 5 times. Everyone thinks, how do we make that happen? And we're slightly at a logjam now where most of us think, well, it's the government's job or it's the city's responsibility to impose new policies. But I hope that we're at some kind of tipping point where people are taking that envelope around us more seriously. In Afghanistan in 2017, 8 times more civilians died from air pollution than from violence and attacks of any kind. So, it's how to implement. And, we did a panel this morning thinking about some very, very small changes. One of the things I'm slightly obsessed about at the moment is about lack of air conditioning in hot locations. And I don't just mean India. In New York City, lots of exams get done in the height of the summer, and poor neighborhoods and schools don't have AC. And there was some big research published in the last couple of years that showed that tens of thousands of students fail their graduation because they sat exams on hot days, right? And we know that when it's hot, your ability to concentrate, your memory recall, all of these things change. When it's hot, for every degree, there's a 6% rise in domestic violence here in India above 30 degrees centigrade, right? This is all lots of scholars working on things like this. So one question would be, why do we do exams in the middle of the summer? Should we have the school academic year ending in December, where it's cooler? Should we as a government prioritize putting AC into low-income schools to make sure that when kids sit exams, they're doing it equally, rather than kids in well-established schools with good air conditioning have a genuine physical advantage? So some of these things can be quite small steps. They require a bit of bravery, and they require our politicians, we just heard Shashi Tharoor, to have a chance. He's great, so I don't mean Shashi, but Mr. Tharoor, I should say, His Excellency. We need to give our politicians more of a chance to be educated. So we have a school of government in Oxford where we are trying to encourage state leaders or high representatives to spend 2 or 3 weeks every summer coming to Oxford to learn what are the latest things in social inequality, in urban regeneration, in sustainable cities. Because if you are a policymaker or a lawmaker, you've got no time to read. And there's no structure to it. You might pick up your book or my book and be inspired. Hopefully you will. But having that educative process is important for those who we vote into office in the democratic world. And it's a problem now, I think, about education. How do we give more tools to people who can make policy to do small things and to do them effectively? But like I said, I hope we're at a tipping point where there are lots of reasons to be more optimistic in the coming years.
So, my last question, perhaps before we break for questions from the audience. What was beautiful, through different chapters. Recently the Earth Commission released, quantified all the Earth system boundaries, whether it be biodiversity or aerosol loading, pollution, water. biochemical flows, and not just climate. Climate is just one of them, and perhaps the threshold of climate as yet has not been crossed, that 1.2 degrees or whatever, warming. And you look at all of these things, you look at all the Earth system boundaries, whether it be nature, extinction of species, or pollution, as you spoke, and water, and to have woven together this tapestry through which to see the past. And what was that like? And yeah.
Well, it's a very nice question because it sounds like I did a good job, so thank you. I mean, I think the climate and the warming thing gets all the headlines, but here in India, the primary thing is first of all water stress. In 2020, 350 billion cubic meters of water was taken from the groundwater in the northern Indian plains, and that, along with glacier melt, has moved the position of the North and the South Pole. Right? That's quite something. In Europe, 10 years ago, 19% of Europe was water stressed. We've had a state of emergency announced in Catalonia around Barcelona 3 days ago to prevent people from using water in the way in which they're used to. In my country, where everyone knows that England didn't do very well in the World Cup cricket, and from what I heard, we're not doing so well this afternoon in the Test match. But the other thing everyone knows about England is it rains quite a lot. But in the UK, our expectations are that by 2030, our demand for water is going to exceed our ability to provide water by 40%. Because we're using more water to make things, to wash, to do all these, and there are finite supplies. So we haven't built a single reservoir, we haven't built a single water capture program for 40 years in the UK. And you see the dam here is shortages, you see with our own eyes. So water's a key thing. Habitat loss and deforestation, of course, changes environments for other animals and so on. And so pollinator loss is a huge problem globally. And losing animals and creatures, we tend to think we must save the rhino, we must save the tiger, we must save animals that we beautify. But it's the little ones that we don't really like. Catherine Rundell was talking about spiders today. It's quite right. Spiders, bugs, the little things, the little flies that fertilize our crops and our food. If those disappear, then we're in real trouble. So trying to be holistic and trying to not just think about climate, but the natural world as a whole, and to try to give a little bit of hope as well. So I did the audio book of this one. My publishers asked me who would like to do the audio recording. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, give us a couple of names. So I went, but everybody must say George Clooney. And they went, okay, do it yourself. So I recorded it. And as I come towards the end of my book, and I say, the Earth survey done in the UK by the British government, by Partha Dasgupta, says that globally we're using 1.6 times the Earth's resources every year. We're crazy as a species to accelerate our own demise. And my producer knocked on the window when I was reading through the last few pages. And he said, look, I'm really sorry, I'm finding this quite difficult to see what reality looks like. When you start layering on what the problems are, not just, 1.5 and so on, but, contraception is ineffective if it's stored above 30 degrees, right? All these things that are coming towards us, maternal health care, the difficulties, cognitive, etc. And I said, don't worry, it's going to be better. And then I put on some pages where we can be optimistic. And the good news about knowledge keepers in universities is that we are producing huge amounts of R&D, huge amounts of innovation, lots of amazingly exciting ideas. The Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge about crazy ideas about how to mitigate and maybe even reverse climate change. Most scientists in the climate space are now thinking, not how do we slow it down? We've gone so far, we're past 1.5. How do we actually reverse? And geoengineering is a tricky one. But there are lots of reasons to be positive and optimistic. But I think that the cascade effect of trying to look at everything in front of us and not just at a warming world is pretty sobering. And it's a job of someone like me as an educator to just explain where we are. It's the job of the people we elect to now work out what we should do, and and for investors to think about what kind of solutions they want, and for voters to decide in countries like ours, where we're lucky enough to choose our own leaders, who do we want to be preparing for, I suppose, some opportunities in the future, but also the real challenges. I mean, there are 500 roughly emerging infectious diseases. They're all highly susceptible to climatic change. We'll have a world by 2080 where 90% is susceptible to malaria and dengue fever. As it happens, my university has produced a malaria vaccine that's now being rolled out into Cameroon. If that works, if we can stay ahead of genetic mutations, then there's lots of reasons to be hopeful. But, we should be planning ahead, like Benjamin Franklin said.
Let's have some questions now. Let me look. That lady in white there, in the middle, standing. Yeah.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, sir. Sir, my question pertains to the methodology of global history itself. How can one practice this kind of history given like we have so many sources? How does one filter out the sources and how does one identify connections on such a vast scale? Thank you.
Are you a historian?
I am doing my master's in history currently, yes.
Good for you. Well done. Good luck. Look, it's really hard, and there are lots of ways, lots of answers one could give. One is high levels of collaboration. You know, no historian works on their own. I mean, not just because we talk to each other, but because we're reading each other's work all the time. So it's a hugely collaborative process. So please don't email me about to ask where the footnotes are in the book. They're all online. I think I've got 4,700 footnotes to show that there are all these wonderful scholars who are working together. There are lots of projects where we collaborate. I'm running a Leverhulme project in Uzbekistan on river systems to look at how rivers have changed over time. And my collaborators I'm working with, some are archaeologists, some are river specialists, some are people who are interested in bone archaeology, some are archaeobotanists, skills that I wouldn't be able to acquire. So a lot is how do we collaborate. With global histories, you know, like all history, it's expensive to train young historians because you have to pay fees, but you've got to learn languages and you've got to learn methodologies. But it is possible to do. But the more we talk to each other, the more we learn from each other, the easier it becomes. Good luck with your studies.
Yeah. Any more questions? We can. Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, please.
Just shout. Oh, great.
Really enjoyed reading your book, very voluminous, but your last two chapters, would you like to expand on it in the future with military missions, something on that, especially since 1991 we are very much in a unipolar world where warfare seems to have become a normal feature of life?
Yeah, okay. I'll try and do a short answer. Yeah, you know, the U.S. Department of Defense is the biggest institutional user of fossil fuels in the world. It would rank fifth if it was an independent state. Flying planes, blowing up tanks, building missiles. It's hugely energy intensive for metals, for everything, rare earths, and so on. A report that came out at the end of last year by the Department of Defense estimates the impact of climate change to US military installations and puts the budget to fix these at $380 billion, just for US defense facilities. There are about 560,000 US military facilities around the world, which is a lot. India doesn't have quite so many, but any state that is involved in missile exploration, space exploration, like India is with its Vikram lander, with its programs to the moon, investing in the military is extremely expensive. And it's highly energy consumptive. If I was to bet, will we spend more in our different countries on defense in 10 years' time than we do today? Yes. Will we spend a lot more on defense than we do today? I would also answer yes. But, you know, historians are very pessimistic. I've got a much more optimistic wife than I, who tells me to keep happy and smiling and not scare people, because why read a book if we're all going to die? I think if you're going to die, then you might as well read a good book, so you might as well read mine. But no, I think depending on defence, it is changing. I mean, nowadays, it takes time to catch up, but submarines, aircraft carriers, big programs are probably in an era now where small technologies make a big difference. The world that we should be protecting against are things like cyber attacks, where one person with a laptop, whether they're in state employ or not, can bring down energy grids, water systems, and those things are difficult to protect against. So, yeah, the militarization of our world is a real problem for energy, for climate, for material consumption, and for hierarchies. People invest in these things, can make big returns, and a more fractured world means bigger opportunities for those who are willing to do so.
Any young people have questions here? Yeah, with the red scarf there. Yeah. First, gentleman with the red scarf. There's a child here with a question.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, you first, ma'am. You first. Yeah.
Hello.
If there's a
Yes.
small child with a question here. Yeah. One second. Yeah. We'll come back to you. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Thank you for coming to my talk. You're the future. You're the next generation that will save the mistakes my generation made.
Okay, so sir, my question is that actually I am also like taking inspirations from almost like many writers. And I wanted to ask that, sir, when you started your journey, getting submerged into the writings and all. So, sir, what was your first thought that no, I'll write this? How did you conclude that what topic to pick? It was like it is very difficult for me to pick a particular topic, that which one should I start with?
I mean, I'm going to say that Yuvan's done a great job moderating, but when I come back to Jaipur next time, will you come and be in discussion with me on the stage? Well, I'm going to give you an answer that's going to be very unhelpful, but will you come and find me afterwards? I'll give you a copy of my Silk Roads illustrated book for younger readers, right? So come and find me, and I will give that to you as a present. But the least you should all give this young lady. But anyway. No, the answer is the answer you don't want me to give, which is don't pick. Read everything. You know, if you are in a buffet, try everything until you find the one thing you think tastes and looks better than anything else. And we are all made different. The things that I chose, no one was interested in. You know, no one thought that anyone would read my books. Even my last publisher didn't refuse to publish the book called The Silk Roads that I wrote. So I had to move publisher to my current home, Bloomsbury. Thank you very much, Bloomsbury. But you need to find something that is passionate for you, that speaks to you, speaks to your heart and your soul, and the thing that you want to then explain to other people. And historians are people who tell other people's stories. And if you can do that as well as you've done this morning, that would be great. But find the thing that you want rather than listen to some old spanker like me.
Is that gentleman with the red scarf.
Hello? Yeah. So I just wanted to know your opinion on the younger dryas impact theory 10,000 years ago. I think there's a view coming that prehistory didn't start from civilizations, but there was civilization before 10,000 BC, and there was a cataclysmic event which wiped out, an ancient form of civilization. Do you have any opinions on that? I don't know if you've heard people like Graham Hancock and Randall Castle and people like that.
Yeah, I mean, okay. Well, the younger dryas is about 10, 12,000 years ago. It's a sort of it's a climatic boundary, and climatic boundaries, a bit like temples for archaeologists. Everybody loves round numbers, right? 10,000, 12,000 years ago. These ideas that there's a sort of spark moment where humans develop agriculture or start living in cities is not a school of scholarship to which I belong. I think the organic, small incremental changes, to be very careful about what we're thinking about when it comes to cities, settled lifestyles, hunter-gatherings. This is a much more blended period. So I'd be very hesitant to pin too much on the younger dryas, apart from the fact that there is a clear moment where we're moving into a new geological time zone. Have we got time for one more before the buzzer?
One more quick question. So a young person there with the pink hat, young boy there, or a girl. Yeah, you with the pink cap there and white sweater.
Are there any knowledges from the past civilizations that we can use to help us in our fight against climate change, and that we can be able to make predictions for our future where the climate and water are concerned?
Okay, I'm just wondering if you can catch Peter after this, if the children can catch you after.
You come and get a book from me. But that question, and the young lady's got all your questions, is the reason why I love this festival. It is such a privilege to have questions like this, brave young people asking. Is there stuff we can learn? Yes, is the short answer. But come and find me as well with the pink hats.
Yeah. Just a last line. The subtitle of the book is An Untold History, and in its vastness and vividness, it's truly that, and I hope you'll buy it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Yuvan.